Good evening. Thank you for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Lumi Tan, an associate curator at The Kitchen, where she organizes exhibitions and produces performances with artists across disciplines and generations. Exhibitions in the 2014-15 season at The Kitchen include Don Vo and Shu Shu Metal, as well as the current group exhibition, No Entrance, No Exit, which is on view at The Kitchen through February 21st. She's also curating a forthcoming exhibition with Annika Yi at The Kitchen. Prior to her work at The Kitchen, Lumi was a guest curator at Frock Noord-Pas-de-Calais in Dunkirk. She was director at Zach Foyer Gallery and a curatorial assistant at PS1. In 2008, she co-founded the online curatorial project Why and Wherefore with Nicholas Wiest and Summer Guthrie. Nick, by the way, went on to found the Shandaken Project, which is a really interesting residency program in the Catskills, which is built sort of on a CSA model with membership. I would encourage you to look into that. And also, Summer curated an exhibition of work by recent MFA Fine Arts graduates at Interstate Projects in Bushwick last summer. So it's a small world. As an independent curator, Lumi has organized over 20 exhibitions in New York and in Europe. Her writing has appeared in Art Forum, in Frieze, the New York Times, and in numerous exhibition catalogs. And she was the associate editor of The Exhibitionist, journal on exhibition making from 2012 to 2014. She received a BA from Bryn Mawr in art history and attended the master's program in art history at Hunter. Please join me in welcoming Lumi Tan.
Thanks, Mark, for the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, thanks. And thanks for inviting me to speak tonight. And of course, thanks so much for inviting me to curate this year's MFA thesis show, which I'm really excited to begin the process of with you guys. So the focus of this talk tonight will be issues specific to a sector I'm going to call small-scale nonprofit in New York City. So this is clearly an issue that's close to my heart since I've been at The Kitchen for almost 5 years now. But it's also an issue which I think is really important to bring to the forefront at this moment because the space is sometimes lost in a kind of gray area between the larger museums and the very active gallery sector in New York City. Especially at this moment, there's constantly these articles that are coming out. I'm sure you've read the ones by David Byrne or Patti Smith that are asking if it's possible to be an artist in New York, if art is dead in New York. I think they both recommended leaving New York to be an artist. There was recently a New York Times article that set to prove that art was not dead in New York, but mainly but used costume parties as an example, or a lot of greater, smaller DIY spaces, but completely ignored this nonprofit sector, which has been, presenting experimental work and taking risks in the artist community for decades now, since the 70s. So for those of you who aren't familiar with The Kitchen, I'll just give a brief history. In 1971, Stana and Woody Vasilka started The Kitchen in the kitchen of the Mercer Art Center. So you can see this is the original space. It's not a typical New York City kitchen. It's pretty big. And they were video pioneers in terms of really working with video as a medium and doing a lot of live editing. And they created The Kitchen to basically present the work of other video artists. And because at the time, video artists were working a lot with synthesizers, their closest allies were electronic musicians, which were also kind of a burgeoning scene at that time. So there were a lot of collaborations between the video artists and the musicians, including Tony Conrad or Laurie Spiegel. And that's a photo of Stana Vasilka editing in the kitchen. This is another sculptural installation by an artist named Ben Tati in 1972. So in 1973, the Mercer Art Center burned down, and the kitchen moved into a new loft space on the corner of Wooster and Broome Street in Soho. At this point, the Vasilkas really wanted to concentrate on being artists and not administrators. So they decamped to Buffalo, where they continued making art and teaching. And this is a moment when the kitchen became slightly more institutionalized. There was a director who was not an artist, and there were curators who were artists. So the curators at this time were not a curator, curating in the same way that I was in terms of sitting at a desk 40 hours a week or being administrators, but they were just other artists who were bringing in their friends, their peers, their communities. So very naturally, the kitchen expanded from a video and music center to, I think the full title became Video, Music, Dance, Performance, Art, and Literature. And so some of these curators, these early curators included Eric Bogosian, who you might know from Law and Order, but he was the first dance curator at the kitchen. He also made posters. He was doing all sorts of office work as well and presenting his own work as a performance artist. Robert Longo was our first video curator, who also performed and presented exhibitions at the kitchen. Arthur Russell and Arto Lindsay were music curators. So these are all artists who were bringing in their friends and their peers, but also continually showing at the kitchen, which was a very important factor for us. So this is an image of a Vito Conci installation from, I think, 1980. Just going to scroll through some images of early works. This is the Beastie Boys performing in 1982. Cindy Sherman's first film still show. And I wanted to show this Robert Mapplethorpe image, postcard image, because it kind of still represents our relationship to galleries, which is that he had to find another space to show the other half of his solo show, essentially, his big first solo show in New York. So the gallery did not want to show his erotic works, and we had to take all of the erotic works at the kitchen, which we were really excited about, of course. And among some of the very first artists we've worked with are still working with us, engaged with us today, including Reese Chatham, Laurie Anderson, Dara Birnbaum, Charles Atlas, Philip Glass, Vito Conci, and many more. And this is just an example of a kitchen calendar from 1980, I believe, so you can just see how much we packed into a single month in one room in a loft space. So in 1985, we moved to our current space in Chelsea. And we purchased the building from Dia. At the time, it was Robert Whitman's studio, all 3 floors of it, which is pretty incredible. And we still have a black box theater on the first floor, and there was also a black box theater on the second floor when we moved into it. In the mid-2000s, when Deb Singer became our director, she kind of formally began a gallery program on the second floor and turned that into a white cube. And through that kind of brought the kitchen back to a place of financial stability, of not that she started a renaissance of the kitchen, but she kind of wanted to make it more relevant to contemporary artists than it had been in the previous 10 years before she got there. And so she kind of brought in a museum bureaucracy in a way. She came from the Whitney, and we didn't have curators before she came in. There were just programming assistants, and artists were still doing the bulk of the curating. And through that, she just kind of stabilized the institution and got us where we are today, which is in a place to destabilize those spaces again. So Tim Griffin became our director about 3 years ago, and he has set out to, again, mix up these spaces to present more performances in the white cube, more installations in the black box, have artists who are interested in working in both spaces, and basically just continuing to push the boundaries of what can happen at the kitchen. Okay, Tim Griffin was the former editor-in-chief of Artforum for 7 years before coming to the kitchen. Before that, he was an arts editor at Time Out, and I think had only curated one show in his professional life before coming to the kitchen. So it may seem like a strange choice for someone like that to be the director of an institution that presents performances and exhibitions, but he actually came from a background in jazz music, in theater. He was in a hip hop group for a while. He's very proud of that, so he's not ashamed of that. So he has a very kind of wide view of the arts in New York, and also, I think his hope was to make the programming more editorialized, and so that would be like each program during a year in the theater and the gallery would appear like an article in a magazine, a thematic issue of Art Forum. So I think we are still striving for that, but in the end, it's really difficult to kind of not force artists, but coerce artists into fitting into one theme during the whole year. And of course, performance schedules are determined years in advance and other challenges. So is that good? Yeah, no problem. So to go back to a term I used at the beginning of the talk, I just wanted to define like what is a small-scale nonprofit sector exactly. And I've been thinking about this a lot as a member of Common Practice, which is an advocacy group for this sector, and stemmed from a group of the same name in London. So we're kind of a franchise of this group in London. So in London, the group included spaces such as the Chisenhale Gallery, Studio Voltaire, and publishers like After All and Mute. And that was created out of a very specific time, which was 2008, global recession. They lost the bulk of their government funding, and they just didn't have the same kind of individual fundraising that we are reliant on. And to deal with this, they really had to prove why they were relevant. They had to produce papers and do the research and prove to the government that they were worth funding. So here in New York, the members include The Kitchen, Artist Space, White Columns, Participant Inc., Triple Canopy, and Light Industry. And so here we have these organizations like The Kitchen, Artist Space, and White Columns that started out in the 70s and are no longer run by their founders. Participant, which is an organization that's 10 years old, that was born out of a really important alternative space called Thread Waxing Space that closed in the 90s, and organizations that are just a few years old like Triple Canopy or Light Industry. And so The Kitchen is the biggest organization in this group with the largest staff and the biggest operating budget. And Light Industry is the smallest. They only have 2 staff members. And clearly the major difference between the London group and the New York group is that we don't have the same type of urgency from government funding. I would say that the most that any of us get from the government is maybe 10%, and it's probably more like 4%. And we're really reliant on private foundations and individual donors and events like our annual gala and our auctions, our benefit auctions. So we kind of have to figure out why we're coming together and what type of urgency we have that is, very different from what London has. So some of the questions we ask ourselves are, do we have a shared ethos? And are we bound together just by size and a certain amount of scrappiness? I personally like to think it's about how we work with artists. In a time when museums are getting bigger and bigger, constantly expanding, what are the advantages to staying small? Oh, do I want to? I'm just going to adjust it. Okay. It's not really. Is that better? Okay. What does it mean to have a small audience who understands the work rather than a large public who doesn't necessarily engage in the same way? What constitutes support for artists in the current landscape, and how do these spaces offer support when the number of opportunities for young artists grow with the number of spaces, museums, commercial galleries, all looking out for emerging artists in a way they weren't previously? Why should a space survive? All the older organizations have been through at least one period in their history where they have almost closed due to a lack of financial support. And should a space survive without its founder? I think the primary example of that would be Exit Art, which closed pretty much right after one of their founders passed away. And finally, why be a nonprofit? I think a lot of younger curators or prospective directors of spaces like this, would much rather start their own gallery to avoid the bureaucracies of running a nonprofit. So why do nonprofits need to exist in the first place? So like the London Group, we're also in the shadow of larger museums like Whitney and MoMA. And the kitchen feels a really specific pressure from the both of these as performance becomes more and more important to their overall programming, both on the sides of audience engagement, knowing that performance brings in a lot of visitors and is thought of as being very cheap to produce, and artists' own interest in interdisciplinarity at this time. And so when MoMA and the Whitney are both expanding and building gray boxes, which are a combination of black boxes and white cubes to show both exhibitions and performances, and when the Whitney is moving downtown to be more engaged in that artistic community, how does our role at the kitchen shift? So of course I don't have answers to these questions, but I think just identifying and exploring these questions in general is an important defense to why we in the New York City art community need these spaces. And at the kitchen, I think we're really conscious of these questions as we organize our programming, and we really want to address these issues head on. And so although I curate in both the theater and the gallery spaces, alongside my colleague Matthew Lyons, for this talk I wanted to concentrate on 2 exhibitions as case studies for how the kitchen moves forward while occupying what I think is a fairly unique position in New York. To preface the first exhibition I'll talk about, one aspect that's really key to the kitchen is how we deal with our institutional history and our archive. Since we started as a space for video and for performance, we have always been obsessed with documentation, and we've always had video equipment at the ready. And so we have just an enormous amount of video documentation, of photo documentation, of posters, press releases, correspondence, all sorts of paper ephemera. In contrast, artist space and white columns really have made it a point not to deal with their own history. So like the first thing that Stefan Kalmar said when he became the director of artist space was that he wanted to throw the archive in the fire. And he sold the archive to Fales immediately. And we also sold our archive to the Getty, but it wasn't because we didn't want to deal with it. It was because our building was no longer a safe place to house the archive, especially in light of Hurricane Sandy, where we got 5 feet of water. And luckily our archive was on the 3rd floor. But unlike artist space and white columns, I think we also just really own this history still, and we really need it. On both the sides of artists and curators. I think any artist who comes into the kitchen feels this history and kind of needs to deal with it in a way, either as like a starting point for their work or also as a way to kind of not get bogged down by it. So just quickly, I'll show you an example of this. So this is a 2012 exhibition by Virginia Overton. And she did not make any work before entering the space for the installation period. She basically just walked around the building and collected, pipes, planks of wood, I-beams, pedestals, and created all the work from that. She also, you can see kind of lit behind the walls to expose this area that, used to be the walls of the Black Box Theater and are now covered up by the white walls of the gallery. She also discovered that we used to have this Lightbox kitchen sign outside, and at some point we took it down and she recreated it, and we actually had her make another one, which is on our building currently. So I've been fortunate enough to work really closely with the archive since I've been at the kitchen. My first show there was an archive show on the occasion of the kitchen's 40th anniversary in 2011. And it was during my research for that I discovered the work of Gretchen Bender, who was a video artist who was a really active member of the kitchen community and frequently collaborated with Robert Longo, who I mentioned was a curator at the kitchen. And in September 2013, we mounted a survey of Gretchen's work called Tracking the Thrill. This is a flyer for her original presentation at the kitchen in 1987, and that image on the right was supposed to be a video that is not working. So I'm sorry for that, but you'll still get to see the piece in its new incarnation. So Gretchen Bender moved to New York in the early 70s, and her early works were silk screens of found images onto tin panels. And so she was working with images in the same way that a lot of her peers in the pictures generation were. But unlike the more kind of detached, restrained way that Sherry Levine or Richard Prince was working with images, she was really invested in kind of the onslaught of media and of imagery. In 1987, she said, "I think of the media as a cannibalistic river, a flow or current that absorbs everything." And she often talked about using media against itself. So she began making videos in the early 1980s, and she was obsessively taping broadcast footage and feature films on her VCR and using what was at the time a very advanced computer software to animate corporate logos such as AT&T, GE, and ABC. She was working in the height of the Reagan era, so she was really interested in critiquing the corporatization of culture and the surveillance state. So in 1984, she created her first electronic performance at the kitchen entitled Dumping Core, which used this wide range of imagery. Like the Total Recall, which you can see, this was a ticketed performance. So you would buy a ticket, come at a specific time, sit down in the theater, wait for the lights to dim, and then watch an 8-minute video installation and then leave. So she really wanted to keep you kind of trapped in the theater to make sure you were just completely inundated by these images and not get distracted in the same way you might with a video installation in a gallery. So there was like a definite beginning and an end, and there was no looping. You really had to experience it as she wanted it. So in 1987, she created a more ambitious version of this performance called Total Recall, which was for 24 monitors and 3 projection screens, and also premiered at the kitchen. And it's worth noting that Bender was able to do such large-scale performances at a nonprofit space because the grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and NYSCA, the New York Council for the Arts, were so bountiful at the time. So you can see how things have changed. Simultaneously, Gretchen was also doing more commercial work to pay the bills. So she made music videos for REM, for New Order, for Megadeth, for Babes in Toyland. And she also notoriously made the opening credits for America's Most Wanted. Yeah, which is really beautiful, and I'll send it to you if it's not available on YouTube. So by the mid-1990s, she kind of turned away from her artwork and concentrated on this commercial work. And then she passed away fairly young in 2004, and her memorial was at the Kitchen's Theater. So it's like clear that how important the Kitchen was to her biography in this way. So this particular show had an unusual starting point, which was that it was originally presented at the Poor Farm in Wisconsin. And so the Poor Farm it's basically an alternative space run at a former farm in rural Wisconsin by Michelle Grabner, who you may know as an artist, curator, writer, teacher extraordinaire, and her husband, the artist Brad Killiam. So this is kind of a companion space to their suburban space outside of Chicago. And so Michelle had introduced the work of Gretchen Bender to one of her students named Philip Vanderheiden. And Philip became just completely obsessed with Gretchen's work, having never heard of it before, and he put in a lot of extraordinary time and research into finding all of her work, which at the time was kind of distributed in private and public collections all over the country. Her brother was running her estate, but had no idea what the inventory was or how any of her works functioned. A lot of the works after her death went to the Mint Museum in North Carolina, where a curator, Carla Hanzai, was working. But once Carla left, no one at the museum knew how to present her work or where it was even. And it was mostly due to Cindy Sherman, who was a really close friend of Gretchen's, who was the one who cleaned out her studio after her death and inventoried all her works. So, she deserves major credit for that. But this just presented a lot of problems for Phil, obviously, who was just traveling around the country, finding everything he could. He went to AT&T's corporate art collection, which had actually bought one of Gretchen's works that used the AT&T logo. And the piece had all these laser discs embedded in it, and all the laser discs had rotted inside the sculpture, so that was completely lost. And that same fate befell Dumping Core, which was the first video performance she did, which is now completely lost. All the master tapes are completely lost. But so Michelle, I think, always had this idea that the kitchen would be interested in this show, taking on this show, and of course we were. And particularly because of the technological challenges and just the fact that Gretchen had stopped making work in the 90s and early 2000s, we just really felt like it was appropriate to kind of bring her, like, quote unquote, home and represent this work in its original setting. So this is a photo of how Total Recall was installed at the Poor Farm. And this is just an example of some of the concessions that Phil had to make presenting this the first time. There are 2 screens instead of 3 screens. The TVs aren't stacked as high as they were in the original because the ceilings were much lower. The screens, the projection screens are supposed to be showing an entirely different video, but he was not able to find that footage in time, so they're showing one channel of the 8 within the monitors. So we felt, this is what Total Recall liked at the kitchen. And so, of course, because we were restaging it in the kitchen's theater, we felt a real responsibility to make it exactly how it was the first time. But all we had were photos and videos of the original, but none of the tech plans. We didn't have anything in our archives in terms of paperwork. And so it was really just looking. It was this really close process of looking, and the video that wasn't playing before was the original documentation of Total Recall, which I wanted to show you. But even like really simple things like, luckily Phil was able to find a motel that was selling all of their CRT monitors and was able to buy them in bulk, because we needed, I think, 60 in total for the show, and otherwise it would have been really difficult to find those monitors. And we've been kind of like shipping them all over the country now for various iterations of Gretchen's work. And people like Robert Longo were extremely helpful in coming over and advising us on how things were originally shown, and who knows if how he remembers it was really correct, but we really appreciated it. Stuart Argabright, who was the composer for the music in Total Recall and Dumping Core and another work that we showed, Wild Dead, is still very active in New York, and he came over quite a bit and checked the levels and had a lot of input as well into how we should be remounting this. So I'm just going to play you some of Total Recall so you can get an idea of what it was like. So that is like one of the climaxes of the piece, kind of right in the middle, and then fireworks explodes. It's very dramatic. And one thing we really pride ourselves on is I think the projection screens, the 3 projection screens, are actually the original screens that she used in '87, and they were very dusty and rolled up somewhere in storage at the kitchen. But a question that came up quite a bit was if Gretchen was still alive, would she have updated all this technology? Would she have replaced everything with a flat screen, for example, or projected the larger images in a different way? Because she was really concerned with using the newest images, because she knew that images were constantly being replaced in the media. And even the title Total Recall was really prescient prescient in that the movie came out 3 years after this piece. And that's because she was always reading trade magazines like Variety and picking up on titles of movies that haven't been made yet. But in the end, it really felt like too big of a decision to drastically change the piece that much without her actually being around. But we did update it to DVDs instead of VHS, and then eventually, after the DVDs were too faulty, we did create a crazy kind of digitized version of the 8 channels. Another change that we had to make was also to put Total Recall into an exhibition format rather than playing it 3 times on 2 evenings, because it took a tremendous amount of work to put this up, and we couldn't imagine having it only up for 2 days. But also, we wanted as many people to see it as possible, so we didn't charge for it. We played it once an hour during our normal gallery hours, and I think that functioned well enough. But in later iterations of this piece, at the Hammer and the Tate Liverpool this past year, I think they just had it on continuous looping, because they just couldn't handle turning it on and off each hour, which was extremely challenging. So then ultimately we represented Dumping Core, which was the first performance that was lost, by showing the documentation of it that Gretchen had made that we still had in the gallery, but away from the artwork, so that it was represented as documentation. And then in its place, we showed this piece called Wild Dead that was considered kind of a draft for Dumping Core, which is a single channel video on 33 monitors. And this was shown in a lot of different variations while she was alive, including in an installation at the club Danceteria, as a 2-monitor piece at the East Village Gallery International with Monuments. So, it could have been presented in a lot of ways, and we had a lot of agonized conversations about how to do it. And basically, we just used every monitor we had left over and presented it this way. And then another kind of agonized conversation we had was how to present her music videos in the America's Most Wanted opening credits. Whether or not one could be projected, if they were all meant for broadcast television. And in the end, we kind of ended up with this very standard, kind of boring monitor display, but it was the best way for people to kind of move from piece to piece. And so in the end, the show really felt like a homecoming for Gretchen's work, and it would have felt, I think, really inappropriate to have it at another New York institution. And it's not to say that we'll be re-performing or representing all this work from our archive now that this was such a successful presentation, but we really did this because of Gretchen's relationship to the kitchen, to the fact that she was really underrepresented in discussions with the Pictures generation or other artists who are kind of working with video in the same way. And her work is just so completely relevant to contemporary society, contemporary art making, and to a whole new generation of artists. So, as I mentioned, after our show, Total Recall went to the Hammer. The Tate Liverpool staged a survey of her show, and a lot of you might have seen a huge installation of hers that was actually made by Phil Vanderheiden for the Whitney Biennial last year on Michelle Grabner's floor. That was a really large piece called People in Pain that was from '84 and was another piece that was totally lost or destroyed sometime after her death. And it also just relates to these long-term relationships that the kitchen really likes to have with their artists throughout our 44-year history at this point, where we like to think that the artists don't outgrow the kitchen as a space to show their work. I think you see this a lot more in performance, where choreographers or directors aren't afraid to show at the same theaters over and over again, but artists don't really view institutional exhibitions in the same way. You don't really want to show at the same smaller gallery every 5 years or something like that, but we like to kind of keep it in the family in this way. So the second show I wanted to talk about was a year later. It was this past September, and a totally different case than Gretchen's work, but another show that I think really could have only happened at the Kitchen. So our director, Tim Griffin, had a very long relationship with Jan Vo and had a lot of conversations with him about doing something at the Kitchen. And I'm sure that most of you know Jan as an extremely successful international artist who has constant solo shows, even between, I think, his show at the Kitchen and now he's had shows at the Humex Foundation in Mexico City, a solo show at Marion Goodman in London, a solo show at the Ludwig Museum in Germany. He's representing Denmark in the Venice Biennale and also curating a very high-profile show there for the Pinot collection. And so with this level of artists, you have to wonder, and I definitely wondered this myself, why he wanted to do a show at the Kitchen and why we would want to work with him. Because he's an artist who can do basically whatever he wants, wherever he wants, with as much money and as big a budget as he wants. Not only being a hugely successful conceptual artist, but also a hugely successful commercial artist. And so, some of the work that has brought him a lot of commercial success are these gold leaf boxes, cardboard boxes and American flags. I'm sure you've seen them around in many institutions or galleries. He does them with Budweiser boxes, Colgate boxes, a number of different beverages or products. And to make these, he works with a gold leaf workshop outside of Bangkok in Thailand. And from these visits to the workshop, I think he's goes there 3 or 4 times a year, he became really interested in the process of gold pounding. So I did not know at all how gold leaf was made before this show, but it is, it starts with a 1-inch cube or square cube that's sliced into a couple of different layers. Then those are put between cellophane. And then it's a very physical process of pounding that packet of cellophane with a bronze and wood hammer on a piece of granite. And it's extremely physical and makes a beautiful sound. And then from there, it's a very gendered process, actually. So only men can do the pounding, and then it's given to the women, who are then given the delicate task of taking the gold leaf out between the cellophane and then putting it in these bigger sheets to be used by people. And so Jan had also, at the same time that he became really interested in these gold pounders, Jan had also been collaborating with the musician Jamie Stewart, who plays under the name Shushu. First for a one-night performance at the Walker Arts Center, and then for another performance for the opening of last year's Berlin Biennale. And so Jan just became really obsessed with Jamie's lyrics, which are very dark and very sexual, and not necessarily so interested in his music, but Shushu's music has a lot of different references. Sometimes it's straight up indie rock, sometimes it's gamelan influenced, sometimes it's free jazz influenced. So Jamie's a really diverse performer in that way. One of their collaboration at the Walker Arts Center was also with Jan's father, Fung Vo, who who's a very talented calligrapher, and I think, is that the word? He does calligraphy. And he has this kind of repertoire that he's learned by sight, because he can't read any of these phrases that Jan gives him, but Jan will give him often very sexually explicit lyrics to use in Jan's work, for which he is fully credited. But for the performance, for example, at the Walker Arts Center, Jamie played the 1980s hit Take My Breath Away, while Jan's father wrote the lyrics live to be projected onto the stage. And so For this exhibition in the kitchen, Jan proposed to make the labor of both gold pounders and the labor of shushu visible for 3 weeks in the kitchen's gallery. So the workshop in Thailand sent a father and a son gold pounding team, Nantapol and Pruan Panicharam. And in the kitchen's humidity condition, it took 3 hours to pound a packet of gold into gold leaf. And then for shushu, for which this show, shushu for this show comprised Jamie Stewart and then 2 other New York-based percussionists, Chess Smith and Shana Dunkelman, attempted to match the labor of the gold pounders by composing 52 5-minute compositions that ranged from heavily notated new music to, again, this improvised free jazz to more fluxus game structures or scores. They used only metal instruments to align themselves with the gold pounders, including cymbals, gongs, cowbells, and vibraphone. And the whole process was very physical and oftentimes quite ridiculous. There was a piece that involved using butterscotch candies and slingshots to hit cymbals. There was a piece where they put vibrators all over the cymbals and vibraphones. And then there were pieces that were, just really pleasurable music. So, and then every 5 minutes to mark the end of the composition, a really shrill alarm would go off like a bell in a school or a factory, and then they would kind of have to gather themselves and move on to the next piece. And the beat of the gold pounders was primarily very steady, but at times would speed up or slow down depending on the progress of the gold leaf. They would continually open up the packet, check it, see if they need to go slower or faster. And so the band would also allow the beat to determine their own tempo. So I'm just going to show you an excerpt of this. So there you could see the gold pounders, see Shushu, hear that 5-minute bell. One thing that's important to know that a lot of people ask us is why Shushu was kind of given like center stage and the gold pounders were off to the side. It was actually a completely structural issue because of the effect that the gold pounding had on our building. They needed to go over a main beam that would not buckle under the weight. And also, because our theater is directly below the gallery, we needed to choose an area where there was not a huge amount of lighting equipment or sound equipment in the theater up in the grid that might fall down and kill someone. And also like my office is on the floor above the gallery and kind of right above the gold pounders, and I was sitting at my desk every day with earplugs and like really working to this rhythm. So it really affected the entire building in this way. And also just more generally, Shushu needed a lot of room for their gear since you see they have a lot of it. So Jan's father was also a collaborator on this show, even though his labor remained invisible. He was there during install doing the freehand calligraphy. This time it was a mix of sexually explicit quotes from Shushu, pop songs by Nico and Rihanna, and theorists Leo Bersani and Artaud. You can kind of see that there. So a line that we used to describe this project was, quote, a gallery exhibition conceived as a stage for their work's own production, end quote. Obviously, the concept of work here is really complicated because of the audience. It's turning in work into performance and vice versa in the case of the musicians. And the audience was really meant to feel comfortable enough to surround the performers, get really close to them, and stay for as long as they liked, which was ideally the 3-hour workday, which a lot of people did do. And you could really quickly see the patterns between the audience who came specifically to see a Jan Vo exhibition, didn't really want to stay more than a few minutes, didn't want to put in earplugs, and audience members who came to see Shushu, who has their own dedicated following, and who were expecting a temporality that was more akin to a music show. And it was also a really rare chance to watch a performer from, a foot away. And while we expected the gold pounders to work without paying the attention much mind, even as they really got in their face with cameras constantly, we didn't expect the same from Shushu as professional performers, but they really surprised us by focusing so intently on their performance and kind of putting the responsibility on the audience members to get out of their way. For example, at the end of each 3-hour workday, they would ritualistically go about completely destroying their set, taking off every symbol, smashing it against the wall, just completely destroying a lot of their equipment. And there are a lot of days where I saw audience members almost get hit by a cymbal or a folding chair, which they were also throwing around. I think on the last day of the show, they flipped a folding table over their head. And not to glorify any potential lawsuits, but this is definitely not something you would see at MoMA or the Whitney. And to this effect, concurrently to the kitchen show, Jan also had a presentation with the Public Art Fund of his We the People project, which a lot of you might have seen in other institutions. It's where Jan has commissioned a factory in China to build a one-to-one replica of the Statue of Liberty. So for the Public Art Fund, he was displaying this work in front of City Hall and also in Brooklyn Bridge Park. So these are two city locations that have a lot of problem with liabilities, a lot of restrictions. And Jan really felt like the kitchen was a counterpoint to this project. For example, for the Public Art Fund, when he was displaying the piece of the Statue of Liberty that's right here, he wasn't allowed to refer to it as an armpit. It was supposed to be called an underarm piece or something like that. And as you can see here, it says, "You come on my lips." Is the rectum a grave? Some, a little more explicit stuff. So Jan himself, who kind of just came in and built the set for this performance and then got out of the way, was really excited and thrilled by the show, but also petrified of it which is what he said at the opening, and he really didn't know what to make of it, and I'm not sure if he is any closer to knowing what he really created by bringing all these collaborators together. And there's a real accomplishment and satisfaction for a curator or an institution like the Kitchen to make an artist of that international stature feel that way. And so that's also a quality that I find really important, and one that I emphasize for the Kitchen and all these other smaller nonprofits in our sector, which is that if MoMA and these other amazing, fantastic museums in New York or the authority were trying to provide kind of the hypothetical, and if they're trying to define a canon, spaces like ours are what art historian David Jozelet has called instant art history. So we're able to be more flexible and more reactive to what's happening in the art communities. But also, we've just been obsessed with documentation throughout our histories because of the ephemeral nature of the work or the artists we show or the space that we have. So we just need to constantly document because we don't know how long we're going to be around. And so these were just two examples of countless shows that I've done at the Kitchen that really challenged my way of working as a curator. And I feel very fortunate that there are these opportunities to feel like there's something different and unique about our kind of space, the way we work with artists, and what we like to think of as the artist audiences, even as we become an established institution. So undoubtedly, there's a certain romanticism around the idea of the 1970s Soho loft, and the idea of artists being in a room and doing whatever they want, and the audience themselves being freer to do what they want. But I think there are a lot of newer, younger spaces that are much better at that now, and located closer to where artists are able to live and work. And I have a real faith that those spaces will continue to proliferate and prove that art is not dead in New York City, while we can be in a place where we are an institution, but we're still able to take on these crazy projects that are presented. So thank you. Absolutely, I feel that way. However, we are still completely dependent on commercial galleries in another way, which is, we have to raise money for every single thing we do. And so without galleries' support through donating to our art auctions, to buying tickets for our gala, to, funding specific shows, we wouldn't be able to exist. So it's really liberating in that way, but you still have a very close relationship with galleries and the market in that way. You can't really get away from it. So, like, for example, our art auction, which raises, I think, almost a quarter of our operating budget, we may ask a totally separate group of artists to donate to that, who will raise money for us than we would show. But we also are an institution that offers half of the profit, half of the retail value back to the artist if it sells in the end. So we try to work as best we can kind of around those systems. And but yes, it is liberating not to have to sell work on that level. Well, the Kitchen's a little different because we have an enormous amount of programming every year. Like that calendar I showed you from 1980, we still have almost as much programming in a month, but not quite. And so there's only two curators. There's myself and Matthew Lyons, and we work between both the theater and the gallery spaces, and we can't possibly program every single thing ourselves. So we still have a curatorial advisory board, which is made up of artists who've had long-term relationships with the Kitchen, such as choreographer Sarah Mitchelson, who does a lot of our dance programming still, and is a a real mentor to younger choreographers, choreographer Dean Moss, the musician and music curator Nick Hallett, and a number of other people. So we rely on them for a lot of our programming still, and to do a lot of the kind of outreach that Matthew and I as two people can't do. A lot of our programming is, again, based on these artists who return to the kitchen a lot and have been throughout their careers. So a theater company might come back to the kitchen every 2 years, and we're happy to have them back because we trust them, we love working with them, we believe in their vision. Same with choreographers. With the exhibitions, it's a little different. For me personally, almost all my shows come out of I'm just saying long-term relationships over and over again because it's Valentine's Day. But it is just really important for me to just continue talking to people over years. And, I might have done 6 studio visits with them before I do a show with them, or their work might have really changed. But I think for Matthew and I both, it's that process of just keeping in contact with this huge group of people in all disciplines and just constantly checking with them, having them send us new projects. Another thing that works to our benefit is that we have these projects that we can plan out 2 years in advance or a year in advance, but then we also have projects that we can do a month in advance, like a literary program or a music program, or so we can work on both these super quick, spontaneous levels and then these long-term projects that take a lot more development and work. I would say just come to a lot of our programming and this word is totally overused, but become part of the community in that way, familiarize yourself with these other artists who are part of the kitchen, and just be present and, see as many things as you can. We have a discussion series that I'll promote here. Called The Lab, which is a monthly series in which we bring together usually 4 artists from different disciplines, so a musician, a visual artist, a choreographer, a writer, and we kind of force them to talk about one topic because so often both in just the physical kitchen building, there'll be people working in the theater, there'll be people working in the gallery that will never see each other, never have any overlap with each other. And obviously they have something in common because they're showing at the kitchen, and they're part of a certain conversation, but it's very rare that they will talk to people outside their disciplines in this way. And the same goes for the audiences who come to the kitchen. We have a very specific music audience that behaves a certain way, a dance audience, a theater audience, a visual arts audience who don't even know that a theater exists, or vice versa. So the lab is a way to force everyone together and make them talk to each other, including the audience. The audience is very, very engaged in the conversation. So yeah, I recommend just seeing as many things as you can and meeting as many people as you can. Maybe if we had a ton of money, we could open multiple spaces, we would do that. And it hasn't been out of the question. There are a lot of, let's say, institutions. I think this is happening more and more. There are institutions or companies or whoever who want the kitchen to do programming for them, and we could split it, kind of split our mission up that way. But I think if you have the resources, you should do it. And if you can have these spaces that function totally differently, as Loring Augustine does, it's a great thing, because I think, of course, it gives them an advantage to cover like a huge range of the market. But the great thing about galleries is that they have the resources to do these really ambitious projects and serve artists in a totally different way. We do have an archive. As I mentioned very briefly, we sold it recently to the Getty, which was a huge decision on our part because this huge part of New York history going to LA was a really big deal. But in that we are also moving all our archives online. So, because one of the issues, again, with us housing the archive personally is that we didn't have the resources or the personnel to deal with, people coming in and looking through the archive in the way. It's not like a browsable archive. So, if you go onto our homepage, there's a link to the archive site where you can very easily browse through. Primarily, we have paper ephemera and photos up right now, but we're working on getting like every video up and every single thing we have. We work with a local high school called Liberty High on 17th Street and 8th Avenue. It's a school specifically for recent immigrants, and so the students are from all over the world. Like, it's incredible, the range. And most of them are just learning English, so our program with them is to have teaching artists who are primarily theater artists from Wooster Group or Elevator Repair Service, these great downtown groups, go in and they lead workshops with the students, and the students present a show at the kitchen, a performance at the kitchen each semester. Unfortunately, that is the only arts program they have. So we feel very connected to them. And it's been, even in my time at the kitchen, it's been extremely difficult to work with them because they lost a lot of their funding. Their administrators don't want their kids to be focusing on anything other than testing. So we're like desperately trying to hold on to them because the students seem to love working in this program, and we love working with them. So that is our only education program at this time. Any other questions? I think that's it. Thanks.